Between 1890 and 1945, America did a lot of things. America helped many Central American nations in the Spanish-American War, and it also became their protector. They also entered World War I, went through a Great Depression, and then went to war again in World War II, and became one of the global powers all in the span of 55 years.
In the election of 1900, the Republicans renominated President McKinley along with war hero and New York Governor Teddy Roosevelt for president. He ran against Democrat William Jennings Bryan.
Bryan was a supporter of the free silver and won his audience with biblical fervors and with his famous speech, Cross of Gold. After a rigorous campaign, McKinley won the re-election and another Bryan lost the presidential race. McKinley ruled the doctrine of imperialism, dominating other nations either by acquiring the land or making them economically dependent. During his presidency, America got involved in the Spanish-American War. Puerto Rico wanted to break from the chains of Spain, and America, lover of freedom, wanted to help. As a result of the war, America gained Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. But McKinley did not end there. He needed some territory in the Middle Passage for America to connect with China. That something was Hawaii. The U.S. caused an uprising, overturning the Hawaiian monarchy. After that, McKinley convinced the Senate to annex Hawaii. Not everyone back home agreed with these imperialist ideas. Anti-imperialists felt imperialism treated the nationalist democratic foundations. During this time, yellow journalism became popular, as well as missionary trips, as they were trying to help educate the people from these new territories. McKinley's presidency ended with a boom, and the war hero Teddy Roosevelt became the president. Teddy began his big stick diplomacy, in which he will intimidate with America's military power and did not harm the countries. Teddy became the protector of the Americans and continued the Monroe Doctrine. He became involved in many Latin American and Central American countries.
After Roosevelt served his 2 terms, he nominated and motivated William Taft to run for president. This backfired on Roosevelt, as Taft was more conservative and did not see big businesses as bad, as long as businesses did not stifle competition, and he replaced many of the people Roosevelt had placed in his presidential cabinet. This caused Roosevelt to challenge Taft to the Republican candidacy. He lost this, but then created the Bull Moose Party to run as president. This caused the election of 1912 to consist of 4 candidates: Woodrow Wilson for the Democrats, Taft for Republicans, Roosevelt as the Bull Moose Party, and Eugene Debs for Socialists. Wilson won this election and created a program he called New Freedom, and it was supposed to encourage market competition and eliminate big company domination. Wilson later led us into World War I.
But before we talk about American involvement in the war, let's talk about what happened before the U.S. got involved. And for that, let's go to the assassination wheel! On June 28, 1914, a Serbian terrorist assassinated Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand. Okay, he got murdered. On July 23rd, the Austrian government declared war against Serbia and invaded the country 4 days later. On August 1st, German government declared war against Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war against France, an ally of Russia, and immediately began an invasion of the neutral country of Belgium. August 4th, Great Britain, as an ally of France, declared war against Germany.
The first major crisis challenging U.S. neutrality and peace was the torpedoing and sinking of a British passenger liner, the Lithuania, on May 7, 1915. Most of the passengers drowned, including 128 Americans.
The second major crisis happened on March 1st when the U.S. newspaper carried the shocking news of a secret offer made by Germany to Mexico. Intercepted by British intelligence, a telegram to Mexico from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann proposed that Mexico ally itself with Germany in return for Germany's pledge to help Mexico recover lost territories, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The Zimmermann telegram aroused the nationalist anger of the American people and convinced Wilson that Germany fully expected a war with the United States. The U.S. joined the war on April 6, 1917. The government had to use a lot of propaganda to get citizens to support being in the war. Citizens did not want to be part of it, but the Espionage and Sedition Act discouraged people from expressing their dislike of the war.
The Selective Service Act was also enacted during World War I, and soldiers began being drafted to go to war. After the defeat of Germany, the major countries met in the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris to formulate a treaty. Wilson advocated for his 14-point plan to be a part of the final treaty.
When the peace conference adjourned in June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles included the following terms. Germany was disarmed and stripped of all of its colonies in Asia and Africa. It was also forced to pay a huge amount of money in reparation for Great Britain and France. Signers of the treaty will join an international peacekeeping organization called the League of Nations. America, however, did not join the League of Nations.
In the years after the end of the war, the U.S. economy skyrocketed in a period known as the Roaring Twenties. The 1920s were an age of dramatic social and political change. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. The nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929, and this economic growth swept many Americans into an affluent but unfamiliar consumer society. People from coast to coast bought the same goods, listened to the same music, and did the same dances, and even used the same slang.
This prosperity did not last long, and the stock market crashed in 1929. The U.S. entered a decade-long depression with unprecedented levels of unemployment. The causes of the crash were uneven distribution of income, stock market speculation, excessive use of credit, overproduction of consumer goods, weak farm economy, government policies, and global economy problems. In order to get the country out of the depression, FDR was elected president in 1932. He continued to be president for 4 terms.
During the first 100 days, he enacted several new programs known as the New Deal, and focused on 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation guaranteed individual bank deposits up to $5,000. The Emergency Banking Relief Act authorized the government to examine the finances of the banks closed during the bank holiday.
Relief programs consisted of the following. The Public Works Administration allotted money to states and local governments for building roads, bridges, dams, and other public works. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men on projects on federal lands and paid their families small monthly sums. The Tennessee Valley Authority hired thousands of people in one of the nation's poorest region, Tennessee Valley, to build dams, operate electrical power plants, control flooding and erosion, and manufacture fertilizers.
One of the most prominent reform acts passed was the Social Security Act. It affected the lives of nearly all Americans for generations to come. It created a federal-based insurance program based upon automatic collection of taxes from employees and employers throughout people's working careers. The Social Security Trust Fund would be used to make monthly payments to retired persons over the age of 65. Receiving benefits under this new law were workers who lost their jobs, people who were blind or otherwise disabled, and dependent children and their mothers. Hitler had been invading several neighboring nations, but when he entered Poland, other countries declared war on Germany for threatening the sovereignty of other nations. The U.S. again declared neutrality, but after the attacks on Pearl Harbor by Japanese on December 7, 1941, the U.S. went to war. France was occupied from the beginning of the war, but in 1944, on D-Day, troops came in from Normandy and drove the Germans back.
The Allies' drive to liberate France began on June 6, 1944, with the largest invasion by the sea in history. On D-Day, British, Canadian, and U.S. forces under the command of General Eisenhower secured several beachheads on the Normandy coast. After this bloody but successful attack, the Allied offensive moved rapidly to roll back German occupation forces. By the end of August, Paris was liberated. By September, Allied troops had crossed the German border into a final push towards Berlin. The Germans launched a desperate counterattack in Belgium in December 1944 in the Battle of the Bulge. After this setback, however, Americans recognized and resumed their advances. A majority of U.S. efforts were used for fighting the Japanese. Now began the long campaign to get within striking distance of Japan's home island by seizing strategic islands in the Pacific. Naval commanders adopted a strategy called island hopping, in which they bypassed strongly held Japanese islands and isolated them with a naval air power. This strategy allowed Allied forces to move rapidly towards Japan. They also promised to return the Philippines after Japan conquered them in 1942.
By this time, the United States had developed a frightfully destructive new weapon. The top-secret Manhattan Project had begun in 1942, directed by physicist John Robert Oppenheimer. The project employed over 100,000 people and spent $2 billion to develop a weapon whose power came from splitting an atom. The atomic bomb, or A-bomb, was successfully tested on July 16, 1945. The new president, Harry Truman, and his wartime allies called on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face utter destruction. When Japan gave an unsatisfactory reply, Truman consulted with his advisors and decided to use a new weapon on the 2 Japanese cities. On August 6th, an A-bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. About 250,000 Japanese died as a result of the 2 bombs. In February 1945, the Big Three, U.S., Great Britain, and Russia, conferred again at Yalta. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed on several things. Germany would be divided into occupation zones. There would be free elections in the liberated countries of Eastern Europe, even though Soviet troops now controlled this territory. The Soviets would enter the war against Japan, which they did on August 8, 1945, just as Japan was about to surrender. A new world peace organization, the United Nations, would be formed at a conference in San Francisco. Unlike the rejection of the League of Nations following World War I, Congress readily accepted the peacekeeping organization that was conceived during World War II and put it in place immediately after the war. At a meeting in 1944 at Dunbar Oaks near Washington, D.C., Allied representatives from the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China proposed an international organization to be called the United Nations. Then in April 1945, delegates from 50 nations assembled in San Francisco, where they took only 8 weeks to draft a charter for the United Nations. The Senate quickly voted to accept U.S. involvement in the UN. The UN came into existence when the majority of member nations ratified its charter.